My own son James and his wife Sarah tried to get rid of me. They thought pushing me down the stairs would look like an accident, and that once I was gone, my house, my savings, and everything I built would be theirs. But I didn't die, and what I did next turned their greedy little plan into the biggest mistake of their lives. I still remember that day vividly. The way the sunlight streamed through the hallway window, casting long shadows on the wooden steps. I had just come home from running errands, my arms full of groceries, when I felt a sudden shove behind me. For a heartbeat, everything slowed. The bag slipped from my hands, rolling across the floor, and my body tumbled down the stairs, hitting each step with a sickening crunch. Pain shot through me, sharp and immediate, but more than the pain, a strange clarity settled over me. They had thought it would be the end, that I would vanish quietly and never see the daylight again. But I was alive, breathing, furious, and painfully aware that my own family had tried to kill me. My son James, who I had raised since he was a boy, looked down at me with a mix of surprise and annoyance, while Sarah hovered behind him, her lips tight, pretending to be concerned. The charade was laughable if it weren't so horrifying. What would you have done in my shoes? I didn't yell, didn't confront them immediately. I could feel the rage simmering, a slow burn inside me. But I needed a plan. I needed to be smarter than they thought. Instead, I got up carefully, clutching the stair railing, and told them, "Accidents happen," letting my voice stay calm, almost indifferent, even though my heart was pounding like a drum. That night, after they had gone to bed, I lay awake in my own room, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shove, the gleam of greed in their eyes, the way Sarah's hand lingered near James's arm, like they were rehearsing this betrayal for months. I couldn't let it slide. I wasn't just angry. They had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I started by installing cameras in the hallways, discreetly hidden, recording every movement. Every smile, every casual step they took around me was now evidence in the making, even if they didn't know it yet. I watched them carefully, noting every lie, every attempt to manipulate, every whisper they thought I wouldn't hear, and they didn't learn from the first shove. A week later, I caught them again, trying something even more reckless, underestimating the fact that I had eyes everywhere. This time, I didn't just survive, I had proof. Hours of footage showing James and Sarah plotting, sneaking around, ready to strike. I felt a dark satisfaction, a cold sense of inevitability settle over me. I knew that when the time came, justice would be mine. But at that moment, I also realized that surviving was only the beginning. Revenge wouldn't be about brute force or yelling. It would be about patience, precision, watching them dig their own graves with their own hands. And as I lay awake plotting the next steps, a thought kept running through my mind. Be honest. Would you have waited this long for payback if your own flesh and blood tried to kill you? I did, because every move they made from that moment on would be under my watchful eye, every lie cataloged, every betrayal stored, until the day I turned it all against them. Little did they know, the biggest mistake of their lives wasn't the shove. It was underestimating me. After that first shove, life around the house became a twisted game of appearances. James acted as if nothing had happened, his voice dripping with false concern every time he asked if I was all right, while Sarah hovered nearby, her helpful gestures thinly veiling the tension in her eyes. They thought I was weakened, fragile, vulnerable, but they couldn't have been more wrong. I moved through my days carefully, pretending to be cautious, polite, even forgetful at times, all while my mind was meticulously cataloging every detail. The cadence of their steps, the way Sarah lingered near the staircase, the tiny glances James would shoot in her direction when he thought I wasn't watching. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I noticed everything. They tried again, subtly this time. A loose railing, a misplaced rug, Little accidents meant to scare me or push me closer to harm. I caught each one, my hidden cameras recording the evidence without them realizing. The realization hit me hard. They weren't just greedy. They were dangerously bold. What kind of people would try to end the life of their own mother who had raised him, nurtured him, and supported them through everything? I found myself replaying that moment on the stairs over and over, not out of fear, but to understand the audacity of their betrayal. How could someone you loved so dearly, someone you trusted, be capable of this? I began to build a mental profile, noting their weaknesses as carefully as a chess player notes every possible move. James had a short temper, especially when he felt cornered, and Sarah had a tendency to over-explain when lying. They were clever, but predictably so. They relied on the assumption that I would be too fragile or too forgiving to retaliate, and that would be their downfall. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in the house grew thick, almost palpable. They would argue quietly in the kitchen, thinking I wasn't listening. Sarah's voice sharp, James muttering under his breath, their frustration mounting because nothing seemed to be going according to their plan. And the more they tried, the more evidence I collected. Every step they took to eliminate me only dug their hole deeper. There were moments, though, when doubt crept in. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how far I could push this. Was it right to watch them so carefully, to gather proof and wait for the perfect moment? Could I trust myself not to cross a line? But then I would remember that shove, the way James's hand pushed me down the stairs, Sarah's cruel little smirk just before it happened, and the doubt would vanish, replaced by the cold fire of Resolute. They thought I was fragile. They thought I was scared. They were wrong. I also had to play the long game carefully. I couldn't confront them yet. They would cover their tracks, and the evidence would be gone. Patience became my weapon. I invited friends over, neighbors I trusted, and subtly planted the idea that I was thinking about making some changes to the will to see how they would react. And react they did. James' eyes would narrow. Sarah's fingers would twitch nervously, their greed showing itself like a beacon in the dark. Every reaction was a confirmation. Every slip a small victory for me. One evening, I noticed them whispering in the living room, the way they always did when they thought I wasn't around. I pretended to be engrossed in reading, barely glancing up, letting them feel safe. But inside, my heart was racing. This was the moment that would define the next phase of my revenge. I knew what they were plotting, and I also knew that when the time came, they would be completely blindsided. Every day became a delicate dance. I had to keep my composure, act like I was fragile, act like I was unaware of the danger they posed. But the cameras captured everything, and I pored over each moment like a detective searching for a confession. I cataloged their greed, their lies, their attempts to manipulate me, and I smiled quietly to myself, imagining the day when it would all come crashing down around them. And here's where it gets even more intense, because just when I thought I had seen the worst of their schemes, they escalated. They began to spread subtle rumors to friends and neighbors, painting me as forgetful, erratic, a woman who could no longer handle her own life. James and Sarah thought the community would believe them, that my reputation would crumble first, making it easier for them to inherit everything without question. But they underestimated me again. I started tracking their movements outside the house, overhearing their conversations at the local coffee shop, noting their alliances, seeing who else was involved in their web of deceit. Every whisper, every glance, every lie became part of a record I was building, a narrative that would one day destroy them completely. Be honest, would you have believed your own son and daughter-in-law could go this far? Would you have stayed silent, patiently collecting proof while they plotted your demise? Most people would panic, make a rash decision, confront them too soon, and risk everything. But I waited, watched, and learned. And every day that passed, I grew more confident that the downfall of James and Sarah wasn't just possible, it was inevitable.
The audacity of James and Sarah only grew bolder as the weeks passed. It was like they had a perverse sense of invincibility, thinking I was too weak, too cautious, too careful to ever confront them. One evening, I came home to find the hallway rug suspiciously bunched near the stairs, the kind of thing that, if I hadn't been on guard, could have sent me sprawling once again. Sarah hovered nearby, pretending to straighten the furniture, and James lingered in the kitchen, his hands trembling slightly as he poured himself a drink. Their confidence was fraying, their greed making them sloppy, and every misstep they made was another piece of the puzzle falling into place. I decided it was time to probe deeper. I started asking casual questions about their plans, their day-to-day routines, planting subtle suggestions about selling the house, changing the will, or moving large sums of money. Each question was met with a nervous glance, a hesitation, a fleeting expression they thought I wouldn't notice. But I did. Every flicker of guilt, every twitch of impatience, I captured with my cameras and logged mentally. They were unraveling in front of me, slowly, deliciously. Then came the night that made everything click. I had been awake for hours, pretending to sleep, when I heard whispers from the hallway. Peering through the cracked bedroom door, I saw them both standing near the stairs, voices low, urgent. Sarah was the first to speak. "Are you sure she won't notice this time? We can't afford a mistake." James's hand rested on the railing, his jaw tight. "We'll be careful. One push, that's it. Then it's done." My heart raced, not with fear, but with a cold, simmering fury. This was the confirmation I needed. They had planned the first shove, and they were ready to try again. Only this time, I would be ready in more ways than one. I began to escalate my countermeasures subtly. I moved cameras to new angles, doubled the memory cards, ensured every inch of the house was under watch. But I didn't stop there. I started leaving little clues that I was aware, hints that someone was watching, that the game they thought they were playing was now under my control. A misplaced newspaper, a casually mentioned conversation, a phone left out in plain sight. It was all calculated. They began to falter, their careful steps growing anxious, their words sharper, more defensive. And I savored it. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about turning their own greed, their own treachery back on them in a way they couldn't anticipate. I began to plan more meticulously. I mapped out the layout of the house, identifying choke points, escape routes, and the places they thought they were safe. I studied their habits, when James was likely to leave his phone unattended, when Sarah tended to let her guard down, the way they whispered in the kitchen. Every behavior was a window into their strategy, and I was learning to predict them almost instinctively. And then came the perfect bait. I accidentally mentioned an old family heirloom, a modest but valuable antique, casually suggesting it might be sold. I watched Sarah's eyes flicker, the briefest flash of greed, and James's hand tighten on his drink. I knew they had taken the bait. They started whispering about it in hushed tones, plotting how to get it into their hands without me noticing. Every move they made was now being meticulously documented, every scheming glance caught on camera. But here's where it got truly tense. They began to escalate in ways I hadn't predicted. Small accidents became bolder. James left a chair precariously near the top of the stairs. Sarah campered with the kitchen tiles. I caught each one in real time, sometimes pretending not to notice, sometimes confronting them indirectly, a sharp remark here or a pointed look there. Each time, I could see the panic in their eyes. The fear that I might be onto them was beginning to take root, and the cracks in their alliance were starting to show. I also started gathering outside evidence, discreetly speaking with neighbors, noting their unusual activity, tracking where they went after leaving the house.
Each conversation, each observation, was like adding another brick to the wall I was building around them. Slowly, invisibly, their world was shrinking while mine expanded. And yet, I remained outwardly calm, polite, even warm. I played the doting mother, the vulnerable figure, the woman who had survived the first shove and had forgotten the fear, all while I silently tightened the noose. One night, I overheard them in the living room again, arguing more intensely than before. Sarah's voice was sharp, accusing. "I told you we need to finish this before she notices." James's response was defensive, almost pleading. "We have to be careful. One mistake and it's over." And just like that, I realized they were panicking. Their careful facade had crumbled completely. The predators had become the prey, and I was ready to strike. Not with violence, but with something far more potent: truth, evidence, and calculated exposure. Be honest, would you have stayed calm if your own son and daughter-in-law plotted to kill you? Not once, but multiple times, believing they could get away with it? Most people would lose control, confront them in rage, or make a mistake that would cost everything. But I stayed patient. Every plan, every shove, every whispered lie they threw into the world was being recorded, and each one would be used to dismantle them piece by piece.
By the end of that week, I had enough evidence to prove their intentions beyond any doubt. Every attempt on my life, every whispered scheme, every misstep they made while plotting their accident was captured on video, meticulously organized, time-stamped, and ready for the authorities. I had turned their confidence, their audacity, into the very tool that would ensure their destruction. The tension in the house had reached a boiling point. James and Sarah had become reckless, and I could feel it in every corner, every shadow, every creak of the floorboards. They were overconfident, thinking I was still the frail, unsuspecting woman they had tried to eliminate. But in reality, I had become the silent observer, the hidden force calculating every move. One evening, I noticed the air between them had shifted. Their whispers were now filled with panic instead of greed. Sarah's hand shook as she tried to straighten the crooked picture frames in the hallway, and James's voice, usually steady when planning their schemes, wavered as he muttered under his breath. They were unraveling, and I could almost taste the anticipation. I spent hours reviewing the footage from the hidden cameras, frame by frame, analyzing every step, every glance, every word. It was like watching a slow-motion movie of betrayal, and it fueled the fire in me. I could see exactly how they thought they were covering their tracks, how they underestimated me, and how each tiny miscalculation could be turned against them. What would you have done in my position? Would you have acted impulsively or waited for the perfect moment, knowing that patience would be the most powerful weapon? I chose patience. The night came when they tried again, more brazen than ever. I had placed the cameras in positions that captured everything: their planning, their nervous glances, their whispered reassurances to one another. They didn't realize that I had anticipated this, that I had arranged the living room furniture, the stairway lighting, even the timing of my movements to ensure I could gather irrefutable evidence. I watched from the shadows as they attempted a maneuver that would have sent me crashing down the stairs, and for the first time, I allowed a small, quiet smile to creep across my face. They were so close, yet so hopelessly blind to the truth. They had no idea that this attempt, meant to end my life, was the moment that would cement theirs. After that night, I knew it was time to begin the next phase of my plan, the calculated, step-by-step dismantling of their lives. I couldn't just go to the authorities and present evidence. It had to be done with precision, with strategy, with timing that would leave them no room to manipulate, no way to escape. I started to map out the sequence in my mind. First, gather corroborating statements from neighbors who had noticed suspicious behavior. Then compile the video evidence into a narrative so clear that even their lawyers would struggle to spin it. Each step was deliberate. Each action, a trap they were walking straight into, unaware of the net closing around them.
Meanwhile, I had to maintain appearances. James still greeted me with forced politeness at breakfast. Sarah hovered in the kitchen pretending to prepare meals, both of them carefully moderating their tone and actions. They thought I didn't see through it, but I did. I watched their every move, noting how fear had started to replace greed, how they were beginning to doubt each other, and how cracks in their relationship were forming. I found myself whispering under my breath, "The higher they climb, the harder they fall," and I couldn't help but feel a dark satisfaction. Then came the subtle manipulations that would set the stage for their downfall. I began leaving small, accidental hints that their conversations and plans were not as private as they believed. A note left partially visible on the kitchen counter, an email left open on the computer screen, a casually mentioned phone call to a friend that they thought I hadn't made. These were psychological nudges, small pushes designed to make them more frantic, more careless. And it worked. The tension in the house became palpable, almost suffocating, as they began second-guessing themselves, each move made with increasing anxiety.
But it wasn't just about fear. It was about making them believe they were in control until the very end. I let them feel that they were still plotting, that their schemes could succeed, even as I set the stage for the final revelation. It was a delicate dance, balancing patience and provocation, observation and intervention, and I thrived in that tension. They were becoming their own worst enemies, and I was merely the quiet force guiding their descent. I also took time to reflect on what had brought us to this point. Years of raising James, investing in our family, trusting them implicitly. All of it seemed like a distant memory when weighed against the cold, calculated betrayal they had committed. The anger, the heartbreak, the disbelief. I felt it all, but it became fuel, refining my focus, sharpening my resolve. Be honest, would you have been able to channel that level of fury into patience, into strategy, instead of letting emotion take over? I could, because I realized that emotion without control would have destroyed me, but controlled emotion, directed with purpose, was unstoppable. By the end of this phase, I had them exactly where I wanted, desperate, insecure, increasingly reckless, and unaware that every word, every action, every attempt to intimidate or harm me had been meticulously recorded and cataloged. Their empire of deceit was built on a shaky foundation, and I had been quietly undermining every single piece without them realizing it. They were trapped in a web of their own making, and I was the silent, inexorable force waiting to reveal the truth and deliver justice. I knew the moment for action had arrived. The waiting, the observing, the collecting of evidence, it had all been preparation for the final act. James and Sarah were already on edge, their nerves frayed from weeks of missteps and paranoia, and I intended to use that against them. But this wasn't about rage or retaliation in the moment. It was about precision, about turning everything they had done into their undoing. I began by organizing the evidence meticulously, the hidden camera footage, neighbors' statements, snippets of overheard conversations, and the little hints they had left behind that betrayed their intentions. Every frame, every word, every gesture became part of the narrative that would expose them completely. I started with subtle psychological maneuvers, letting them believe that nothing had changed, that I was still the vulnerable mother who had survived by luck. At breakfast, I smiled as James fumbled with his coffee cup. Sarah hovered, adjusting a napkin, all the while unaware that I had already mapped their reactions, planned my counters, and anticipated their attempts to manipulate me. I let small things happen, misplaced items, half-heard conversations, a casual forgetting to mention that I had cleaned the stair railing they had tampered with, each action feeding their growing sense of unease. Every mistake they made, every slip of the tongue, became another brick in the wall I was building around them. Then I escalated. I began planting evidence of their plotting where it couldn't be ignored. Letters, emails, phone recordings, even a handwritten note from Sarah that she thought had been destroyed.
Everything surfaced carefully, deliberately, so that by the time I presented it to the authorities, there would be no room for denial. I was careful to stay just out of reach, never revealing my hand too soon, letting them stew in their own paranoia while I pulled the strings. The tension in the house became almost unbearable. They started second-guessing each other constantly. James would accuse Sarah of hiding things. Sarah would blame James for being reckless. Arguments erupted, loud enough to be heard beyond the walls, yet subtle enough that a neighbor might think it was just marital tension. I watched from the sidelines, my heart pounding, satisfaction mingling with lingering pain. I allowed them to dig their own graves, shaping the narrative, while they remained convinced they were still in control. Every close call only sharpened the edge of my plan. Once, James nearly caught me reviewing the footage in my study, and for a moment I froze, hammering in my chest. But he passed by, distracted by a trivial task, unaware that I had anticipated the interruption and staged it to appear as nothing more than a casual glance at old family photos. I smiled quietly to myself. Every near discovery, every brush with exposure only confirmed that I was ready. They were blind, greedy, and reckless, and I had become their shadow, their silent judge, recording every move. Then I began the process of tightening the net. I contacted a lawyer I trusted, carefully outlining the evidence, ensuring that the timeline of their actions was clear and indisputable. I spoke with neighbors who had noticed strange behaviors, their testimonies corroborating the footage I had collected. Every step was calculated, designed to make their downfall unavoidable. And all the while, I maintained my outward composure, greeting them with smiles, polite conversations, even the occasional lighthearted joke, all while knowing that their world was about to collapse around them.
The climax of this phase came the day I handed the compiled evidence to the police myself. I watched their faces from a distance, unaware that their empire of deceit had already begun to crumble. Sarah's eyes widened as the reality hit her. James's jaw tightened, panic flooding through him in waves. They had underestimated me at every turn, assumed that surviving the first shove meant weakness, and now the full weight of their actions was descending upon them. I could feel a sense of vindication deep in my chest, but I also allowed myself a quiet reflection. This wasn't just revenge, it was justice, carefully measured and deliberate. And even then, the psychological impact on them was part of the satisfaction. James called out, desperate, trying to explain, to plead, to minimize, while Sarah wept quietly, realizing that their greed had not just failed, it had led them straight into the consequences they so richly deserved. I stood firm, calm, almost detached, letting the system take over. The fury that had simmered inside me had been transformed into strategy, patience, and resolve. Their downfall was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. Be honest. Would you have stayed so calm, so meticulous, while the people who were supposed to love you tried to end your life? Most would have let rage take over, would have confronted them too soon, would have risked losing the upper hand. But I stayed patient, precise, and relentless. And as I watched James and Sarah's world unravel, I realized that the biggest mistake of their lives wasn't the shove. They underestimated me. The day everything came to a head felt unreal, like a movie scene where the camera finally pulls back and you can see the full disaster you'd been shaping all along. I remember the metallic smell of the courthouse air, the distant murmur of other people's problems, and the strange, almost clinical calm that settled over me as I walked in with the lawyer who had become my quiet ally. James and my daughter-in-law, Sarah, sat across from me. Smaller somehow. No longer the confident pair who had tried to erase me from the world, but two shells, hollowed out by panic and regret. Their hands were clasped together, an attempt at solidarity that felt horribly desperate. They looked at me with a mix of guilt and calculation. Even then, they were trying to figure how to spin it. It didn't work. Not this time.
When I listened to the prosecuting attorney lay out the evidence, it felt like watching a carefully wound clock finally chime. The videos I had recorded, the notes I had dug up, the neighbors who had come forward, every piece fell into place with devastating clarity. I heard each clip played back, watch faces on the screen twist and contort with motive and malice, and felt a quiet satisfaction, along with an ache that would never entirely leave me. The deputies who had taken the original report looked grave as they described the pattern: attempts, escalation, intent. The defense tried their best. Lawyers can spin seas into deserts if you let them. But when footage shows hands pushing, when messages reveal planning, when testimonials confirm repeated schemes, there's very little left to weave into plausible deniability. James tried to speak for himself once, his voice thin and wavering. "He's my mother," he said, the words sounding like a plea rather than a statement. But he couldn't finish. The judge's eyes narrowed. He had seen that look before, the look of someone who'd been caught with their hand in the cookie jar. Sarah's face went pale. She avoided my gaze, eyes flicking to the floor as if the boards there could swallow her whole and save her from what we all knew had to happen next. Did I feel triumph at that moment? Yes, but it was a cold triumph, sharpened by sorrow. This was my son. This was someone I had raised. The thing that cut deeper than their betrayal was the knowledge that they had so carelessly cheapened what family meant. When the verdict came, it arrived with the kind of slow, unavoidable certainty that I'd built up over months. Guilty. The courtroom hummed with a brief, stunned silence that felt like the world catching its breath. Sentencing followed, and the punishment was as severe as the law allowed. Watching them led away, handcuffed, their eyes briefly meeting mine, I felt something complicated settle into my chest. Relief, yes, but also an unexpected hollowness. I had wanted justice, and I had it, but justice is not the same as reunion or healing. There was no joy parade, no triumphant music. There was cold metal and the rustle of legal papers and the muffled sob from a woman who had once been my daughter-in-law.
The days after were a strange blur. Neighbors who had once smiled while passing my garden now stopped to say things like, "We're so sorry," or "If you need anything." People I hadn't heard from in years offered condolences and a kind of cautious admiration. "Survivor," they murmured, as if that neatly captured what had happened. The house felt too quiet. The echoes of their footsteps were gone, leaving only the memory of where the rug had been bunched, where the railing had been loosened. I found myself standing at the top of the stairs sometimes, fingers tracing the banister with a sort of ritual reverence, as if touching it could reverse the years of betrayal, or at least help me mark the boundary between what had been and what remained. Friends asked me what I would have done differently. Some said I was too patient, others that I was too calculating. But when I look back now, I know the truth. Patience was the only form of power I had left that couldn't be taken from me. If I had confronted James and my daughter-in-law Sarah in a rage, if I had allowed my pain to push me into hasty action, they might have covered their tracks, changed their stories, made me sound unhinged. Instead, by staying calm, documenting everything, and letting the law do its work, I turned the greed that had fueled their plots into the chain that bound them. Was that cold? Perhaps. Was it necessary? Absolutely. People always ask, what about forgiveness? What about the future? I won't pretend I have words of saintly charity to offer. Forgiveness is not a light switch you flip because the calendar says so. It's a slow thing, a negotiation between the part of you that wants peace and the part that remembers clearly the feel of being shoved down a wooden stair. Over time, I softened in ways I didn't expect, the edges of my anger smoothed, not because I forgot what they'd done, but because I chose not to keep resetting the injuries in my mind every morning. That choice didn't undo the past, but it allowed me to reclaim a life that had been narrowed to a single act of violence. There were practical consequences to manage, too. Legal battles, probate, interviews with social workers who wanted to ensure I was safe. The administrative aftermath of betrayal is its own kind of labor. Some family members took sides, others retreated. I learned who I could count on and who would watch the spectacle and then vanish. It hurt. It taught me the inconvenient truth that many people prefer comfort to confrontation and will choose distance over the messiness of being involved. But there were also unexpected kindnesses. The neighbor who shoved my lawnmower up the driveway when I struggled, the friend who brought soup and stayed long enough to talk, not in whispers, but in honest, steady sentences that didn't pretend everything was fine. Sometimes late at night, I replay the moments before the first shove. I think about how complacency had crept into my home, how love had calcified into expectation, and how easily that expectation can be weaponized. I ask myself questions I don't always want answers to. Could I have seen it sooner? Should I have done something different? And then I remind myself that hindsight is a colder historian than life is a storyteller. I did what I could with the clarity I had when the time came, and that in itself was enough to tilt the balance back toward justice. People always ask, would you recommend this path to someone else? Would you tell a friend to install cameras and wait? It's a difficult question because every situation is different. But I will say this plainly. If your life is genuinely in danger and those closest to you are the threat, you owe it to yourself to be smart. Confrontation is not always bravery. Strategic action can be braver. What I wanted, what any sane person would want, was to live another day. And when I got that day, I used it to make sure the people who tried to take my life were held accountable. In the quiet that followed, the house slowly began to feel like mine again. I repainted the hallway, not to erase what had happened, but to mark a new chapter. I planted flowers in the garden that James had once mowed, because the small act of tending something living felt like an affirmation that life goes on, stubborn and insistent. I wrote letters I never sent, and read them back to myself, pages of grief and fury and pragmatic resolve. Those letters became part of the slow, steady work of rebuilding trust, not with them, never with them, but with the world I still inhabited.
So here I am, older, more cautious, and sharper in ways that I didn't ask to be. I walk carefully sometimes, but not because I'm afraid. I walk carefully because I know the world can be brittle and that the people you love can surprise you with the depths of their greed. Be honest. If it had been you, would you have waited? Would you have turned every whisper into evidence and every shove into testimony? I waited because I believed that justice could be patient, and because I wanted to make sure that when the time came, their empire of lies would collapse under the weight of its own deceit. Some nights I wake up and still think about James and my daughter-in-law Sarah behind bars. The image doesn't comfort me the way vengeance is supposed to in stories. There's no giddy triumph, but there is a clear, resolute satisfaction. They tried to take everything from me, and they failed. They chose to gamble their souls for a house and a savings account. They lost. In the end, the biggest mistake of their lives was not that they pushed me down the stairs. It was thinking I would remain quiet about it. They thought they could bury the truth. They couldn't. And that, more than punishment, felt like the most honest, lasting kind of justice. After the courtroom verdict, life didn't simply snap back into a normal rhythm. The echoes of what James and my daughter-in-law Sarah had attempted to do lingered in every corner of the house, in every creak of the stairs, in the way the sunlight hit the hallway in the morning. I had survived, yes, and justice had been served, but survival came with a weight that no one outside could fully understand. Even mundane tasks carrying an undercurrent of vigilance. Every phone call, every knock at the door, every unexpected visitor became an occasion to scan, observe, and assess. Trust had been fractured in ways that might never heal, and part of me understood that the world, the family, and even the home I had built would always carry shadows from those days. I found myself reflecting often on James and Sarah, not out of sympathy, but because their actions had become a mirror of human frailty, greed, and desperation.
How can people you raised, nurtured, and loved twist that trust into something so dark? It wasn't just the act itself. It was the audacity, the casual assumption that they could take life for granted, that they could erase someone who had been their anchor. And yet, even in reflection, I found a strange, almost cold clarity. I understood that their punishment, the months behind bars, the ruin of their plans, was necessary, not for revenge's sake alone, but to reestablish the moral balance they had shattered. Life outside the immediate drama began to slowly intrude again. Friends and neighbors who had stood back and watched the unfolding tension with polite concern started to re-enter my life in small, tentative ways. Conversations turned to gardening, recipes, local news, mundane things that felt almost foreign after months of fear and scheming. I noticed how quickly the community had formed opinions about James and Sarah, how word of their attempts had spread, and how their reputations had been irrevocably altered. People now looked at me differently, not just as the woman who had survived, but as someone who had exercised patience, intelligence, and strategic thinking in a situation most would have crumbled under. I also began to organize my personal affairs, ensuring that nothing they could have exploited remained vulnerable. Financial accounts, legal documents, property titles, I tightened them all, not out of paranoia, but out of hard-earned wisdom. Every step was an affirmation that I had regained control, that the chaos they had introduced could be managed, mitigated, and finally turned into lessons that would shape the rest of my life. In quiet moments, I allowed myself to grieve, not for the injustice alone, but for the loss of what I had once taken for granted. Family gatherings now carried the weight of absence, not just physically, but emotionally. I missed what could have been if James and Sarah had been different, if loyalty had been chosen over greed. But grief was tempered with resolve. I knew that what they had tried to do would define my vigilance forever, and that the scars they left behind were part of the architecture of my survival. Evenings became my time for reflection and quiet reclamation of space. I would sit in the living room, a cup of tea in hand, reviewing the events in my mind, not out of obsession, but to ensure that clarity remained. The house, once a site of betrayal, began to feel like home again. The sunlight on the staircase no longer carried the same menace. The creaking floorboards were just floorboards, not potential threats. Every sound, every shadow, every memory had been cataloged, understood, and placed in its proper context.
And there was a subtle joy in the mundane. Cooking dinner, tending the garden, reading quietly in the afternoon sunlight. Simple acts that had once been overshadowed by fear now became affirmations of life, resilience, and the quiet power of patience. I began to appreciate the ordinary in ways I hadn't before, understanding that survival wasn't just about enduring threats, it was about reclaiming the ordinary moments, making them yours again after they had been threatened. At times, I would hear news of James and Sarah in prison. Small snippets, letters, or mutual acquaintances letting me know how they were faring. There was no schadenfreude in it, only a cold, measured satisfaction that justice had found its path. They had gambled everything for a quick inheritance, a moment of greed, and they had lost. And in losing, they had affirmed the lessons I had painstakingly learned. Vigilance, patience, and measured action can be more powerful than rage, more enduring than immediate retribution, and infinitely more effective in securing justice. Be honest, if this had been your life, would you have waited so long, calculated so carefully, and let the law work its course? Most people would have acted impulsively, perhaps out of anger or fear, and risked letting the guilty walk free. But I didn't. I waited. I observed. I built the case, strengthened my position, and turned their own actions into the instrument of justice. That patience, that meticulous planning, became my strongest form of empowerment. And in those quiet reflections, as I sipped my tea and watched the sun dip behind the trees outside my window, I realized something profound. Survival was only the beginning. Justice was only the next step. True reclamation of space, of peace, of life itself came from understanding, preparation, and the refusal to let treachery define you. James and my daughter-in-law Sarah had tried to erase me, but instead they became the architects of their own downfall, and I became the author of my own resurgence.
After James and my daughter-in-law Sarah were taken away, the house settled into an eerie kind of calm. The absence of their plodding footsteps and whispered conspiracies left a quiet that was almost disorienting. I spent the first few weeks simply adjusting to the new normal, sleeping through the night without fear of being shoved down the stairs, walking through the hallways without checking for traps, opening doors without bracing myself. It was liberating and terrifying at the same time, this sudden freedom from the constant threat. The house felt like a blank canvas, and for the first time in years, I could decide how to fill it. I began reclaiming my space slowly. I reorganized rooms, painted walls in colors I had always liked but never chosen, and rearranged furniture to suit my own comfort rather than accommodate potential threats. Each small act was an affirmation of control, a reminder that the life I had built for myself could no longer be stolen or manipulated by those who had once sought to destroy me. I spent hours in the garden, hands deep in the soil, planting flowers and shrubs that symbolized resilience and growth. The physical labor was cathartic. It reminded me that I was alive, capable, and unbroken. But reclaiming my life wasn't just about space. It was about rebuilding trust, starting with myself. I journaled daily, documenting my feelings, my fears, my small victories, and my reflections. I read old letters, revisited photographs, and acknowledged the pain without letting it define me. The act of writing became a ritual of empowerment, a way to process the betrayal without letting it fester into bitterness. I allowed myself to cry when memories of the shove and their plotting came to the surface, but each tear felt cleansing rather than destructive. Friends and extended family began to re-enter my life, cautiously at first, uncertain how to navigate the new dynamics. Some had always known, some had suspected, and some had been entirely oblivious. Conversations were awkward at times, punctuated by cautious smiles and tentative questions about my well-being. But gradually, as they saw me thriving, as I reclaimed my autonomy and rebuilt routines, the interactions became more natural. I realized that trust, like a muscle, could be strengthened again, though I would always carry a scar from those who had betrayed me.
One of the most profound lessons during this period was learning to forgive. Not Sarah and James, not yet perhaps, and not entirely, but learning to forgive myself for the moments of fear and hesitation that had allowed them their first shove. Forgiveness in this context wasn't about excusing their actions. It was about freeing myself from the constant replay of what could have happened. It was about reclaiming peace, about acknowledging that I had survived and that my actions had ultimately led to justice. By forgiving myself, I allowed space for growth, for clarity, and for the possibility of happiness that wasn't overshadowed by trauma. As the weeks turned into months, I began to venture further, rebuilding social connections, engaging in hobbies I had abandoned, and even volunteering locally. The world outside my home, once fraught with caution, now seemed full of opportunity and renewal. I realized that life's fragility could either paralyze or empower, and I chose empowerment. Each smile shared, each conversation held without fear, and each small act of normalcy became a testament to my resilience. I also took time to reflect on the nature of James and Sarah's betrayal. I thought about the subtle signs I had missed, the greed that had clouded their judgment, and the audacity that had led them to believe I could be so easily removed from my own life. These reflections weren't about revenge anymore. They were about understanding human nature, about recognizing patterns, and about equipping myself to never be vulnerable in that way again. I had survived not by luck, but by vigilance, strategy, and patience. And understanding that became a source of quiet strength, a reminder that knowledge and awareness could be as powerful as any physical safeguard. Even in moments of solitude, I felt a strange satisfaction, a quiet validation that the months of meticulous planning, observation, and evidence gathering had led to a just outcome. I didn't relish punishment, but I acknowledged the inevitability of consequence. They had gambled, misjudged, and failed, and I had survived, not just physically, but psychologically, emotionally, and morally intact. It was a rare kind of victory, one not loud or dramatic, but steady, measured, and enduring. Be honest. If you had lived through a betrayal so intimate, so deliberate, would you have believed that peace and renewal were possible? I did, because I learned that reclaiming life after such trauma wasn't about erasing the past. It was about integrating it, learning from it, and using it as a foundation for a stronger, wiser self. And that wisdom became my true inheritance, far beyond property, money, or titles. Over time, the days began to feel lighter, though the shadows of what James and my daughter-in-law Sarah had attempted lingered in quiet moments. I realized that healing wasn't a straight line. It was a series of small victories, each one building on the last, each one a subtle assertion that I was still here, still intact, still capable of shaping my own life. I spent mornings tending to the garden, afternoons reading or walking in the neighborhood, and evenings reflecting on the journey I had endured. Each act of ordinary life became a symbol of resilience, a statement that their betrayal, no matter how brutal, could not define me. Friends and neighbors became witnesses to my quiet recovery. They saw me laughing again, heard me speaking with confidence, noticed how I carried myself without fear. It wasn't a performance. It was the tangible outcome of months of careful strategy, patient observation, and measured action. I had survived attempts on my life, gathered irrefutable evidence, ensured justice, and now I was reclaiming joy in the ordinary. Even simple interactions, sharing a cup of tea with a friend, greeting a neighbor on a sunny morning, felt revolutionary after the constant tension of previous months. I also took time to examine my own growth through this ordeal. The fear and anger that had once consumed me were now tempered with wisdom and vigilance. I understood how betrayal could come in subtle forms, how greed could corrode relationships, and how careful observation and patience could turn vulnerability into strength. I had learned not only how to protect myself, but how to anticipate deceit, how to trust cautiously, and how to act decisively when the stakes were life-altering. These lessons were hard-earned, but they became part of my armor, a shield forged from experience rather than fear. At times, I thought about James and Sarah, about the lives they had chosen and the consequences they now faced. I didn't harbor glee or relish their punishment. It was justice, measured and inevitable, not a theatrical revenge. But I did feel a quiet satisfaction knowing that their actions had led them to the consequences they deserved. They had gambled everything for selfish gain, and in doing so, revealed themselves completely. Their downfall was a testament to the consequences of greed and the limits of cunning when faced with resilience and strategic patience. There were also moments of reflection that went deeper than justice. I thought about trust, about family, about the fragility of relationships when loyalty is betrayed. I realized that the ordeal had fundamentally changed my perception of what it meant to love and protect those closest to you.
I had loved James, trusted Sarah, and yet their choices had forced me to confront harsh truths about human nature. Accepting those truths didn't make me bitter. It made me vigilant, empowered, and deeply aware of the boundaries necessary to protect myself and my life. As months turned into years, I felt the slow, steady return of peace. The house, once filled with tension and fear, became a sanctuary again. I painted, planted, and curated spaces that brought comfort and joy. I developed routines that reinforced my autonomy and independence. Even in solitude, I felt whole. The trauma of betrayal remained a memory, but it no longer dictated the rhythm of my days. Instead, it became a point of reflection, a reminder that survival requires intelligence, courage, and patience. I also began mentoring friends and younger family members, sharing lessons about vigilance, strategic thinking, and resilience. Not the details of betrayal, but the principles of self-protection and measured response. It was a way to transform pain into purpose, to ensure that my experience could help others navigate treacherous situations without succumbing to fear or impulsive actions. Teaching, guiding, and witnessing growth in others became an unexpected source of healing and empowerment. Be honest. If you had been pushed to the brink by the people you loved most, would you have believed that renewal was possible? That peace could be restored without sacrificing dignity or wisdom? I did. I found that patience, preparation, and moral clarity could rebuild a life even after betrayal had cut deep. And in that restoration, I discovered the truest form of strength. Not the ability to punish, but the ability to reclaim, rebuild, and thrive despite the darkness others tried to impose.
Eventually, the story of James and Sarah faded from casual conversation, but it remained a quiet lesson etched into my life. I no longer feared the shadows or second-guessed every gesture around me. I moved freely through my home, engaged with my community, and nurtured the relationships that were genuine. Every day was a testament to endurance, intelligence, and the power of measured action. I had survived attempts on my life, turned betrayal into accountability, and ultimately reclaimed my world. Not through impulsive vengeance, but through patience, clarity, and unwavering resolve. And with it, a sense of peace I had long thought impossible. The house that had once been a battleground now felt like home in the truest sense, not because the past was erased, but because I had reclaimed it. Every room, every corner, every familiar sound was a reminder that I had survived, that I had been tested, and that I had emerged not broken, but stronger. I walked through the halls slowly, deliberately, tracing the edges of the banister that had once been a site of danger, feeling the texture of wood beneath my fingers, and reminding myself that I was in control. The legal aftermath had faded into memory. James and my daughter-in-law Sarah were serving their sentences, and the world had moved on. I didn't linger in gloating or bitterness. Instead, I allowed myself to focus on the life I had rebuilt. I reconnected with friends and neighbors in ways that felt genuine, sharing stories that didn't involve fear or betrayal, but life, growth, and cautious hope. I volunteered locally, tending to community gardens and supporting neighbors. And I discovered that small acts of care were profoundly restorative. The simplest gestures became affirmations that life could be beautiful again. My garden flowers seemed brighter, and the birdsong sweeter. Internally, I felt a quiet but unshakable empowerment. I had survived the unthinkable, endured betrayal at the hands of the people who were supposed to love me, and orchestrated justice with patience and intelligence rather than rash anger. That realization gave me a perspective few people ever achieve,
The understanding that true power isn't about retaliation in the heat of the moment, but about observation, strategy, and measured action. I had wielded my intellect and patience as weapons, and they had succeeded where brute emotion might have failed. Reflection became part of my daily ritual. I thought about James and Sarah, not with desire for revenge, but with clarity about human nature, the fragility of trust, and the necessity of vigilance. I reminded myself that betrayal doesn't define the victim unless they allow it to. I reclaimed my agency in every decision I made, every step I took, every interaction I had. And through that reclamation, I found a freedom that was hard-won and deeply satisfying. There were moments when memories struck sharply, when the stairs creaked just slightly differently, when the sunlight fell in a particular way. But each time I breathed deeply and reminded myself that I was no longer the person who had been vulnerable. I was a survivor, a strategist, and someone who had reclaimed not just her life, but her dignity. I let go of anger gradually, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary for my own peace. I understood that holding on to rage would have only tethered me to the trauma, while letting it go allowed me to fully inhabit the life I had fought to preserve. In practical terms, I fortified my world. I improved security, organized my affairs meticulously, and surrounded myself with people who were trustworthy and kind. But beyond the physical measures, I fortified myself emotionally and mentally, carrying the lessons of betrayal as tools rather than weights. I had learned that preparation, patience, and clarity could turn vulnerability into strength, and that those who seek to harm you can only succeed if you allow them to. Looking back, the entire ordeal, from the shove down the stairs to the months of observation and evidence gathering, to the courtroom and aftermath, felt like a long, dark tunnel that finally opened into light. I had endured fear, heartbreak, and disbelief, and yet I emerged capable of joy, peace, and empowerment. I had taken the darkest moment of my life and transformed it into a story of survival and justice. And that, ultimately, was more satisfying than any immediate revenge could have been. So I stand here now, quietly, firmly, and with a sense of completeness that surprises even me. Life has returned not as it was, but as it should be, mine, whole and reclaimed. The betrayal of James and my daughter-in-law Sarah is a chapter, not the whole book. I walk forward with awareness, strength, and the unshakable knowledge that patience, strategy, and moral clarity can overcome even the deepest treachery. And I leave you with this question, because it lingers for me every day. If you were faced with the ultimate betrayal, the kind that threatens your very life, would you have the patience, the clarity, and the courage to wait, to plan, and to ensure that justice, not impulse, prevailed? Because that is the power I discovered, and it is a power that no shove, no greed, and no betrayal can ever take away.